The easiest way to lose a room is to assume you already understand the quietest person in it. Nobody in the lounge knew those words would define the entire night, but the lesson was already waiting beneath the warm lights and polished glass. Rain drifted down the towering windows of a luxury Manhattan rooftop bar, turning the city beyond into a river of gold and silver reflections. Inside, wealthy professionals filled the room with confidence. Conversations about investments, acquisitions, and opportunities floated through the air while soft jazz played in the background. Every table seemed occupied by people accustomed to being noticed. Every table except the bar. Jasmine Carter moved calmly behind the marble counter, arranging crystal glasses and serving drinks with practiced precision. To most guests, she was simply part of the scenery. A bartender, a woman doing her job, someone who belonged in the background of other people's important stories. Jasmine never minded being underestimated. Invisible people learned things visible people missed. She noticed who tipped generously when nobody was watching. She noticed who spoke respectfully to staff and who only performed kindness for an audience. Most importantly, she noticed patterns. Small details that appeared meaningless alone but revealed something larger when connected together. Tonight, the patterns felt different. At 7:45, three men entered the lounge separately. Different clothes, different ages, different tables. Yet all three selected seats that provided a clear view of the VIP section near the windows. None acknowledged one another. None seemed interested in socializing. One ordered a drink and barely touched it. Another checked the room more often than his phone. The third spent most of his time watching reflections in the glass. Jasmine noticed every detail while maintaining the appearance of complete indifference. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the skyline. Inside, anticipation quietly built. At exactly 8:15, several staff members suddenly became more alert. Managers checked reservations again. Security adjusted positions near the elevators. A familiar name had appeared on the evening schedule. Ethan Brooks. Even before he arrived, the room reacted to him. Some guests straightened in their chairs. Others casually mentioned his name as though they knew him personally. Reputation traveled faster than people. Jasmine wiped the bar and watched the elevators through a reflection rather than directly. The three strangers reacted almost immediately when Ethan's arrival became imminent. One glanced toward the entrance. Another checked his watch. The third sat up, slightly straighter. The movements lasted only seconds, but together they formed a language Jasmine understood. They were waiting for something, or someone. Moments later, the private elevators opened. Ethan Brooks stepped into the lounge wearing a tailored charcoal suit and the calm confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention without asking for it. Conversations softened. Heads turned. The atmosphere shifted. Yet while everyone else focused on Ethan, Jasmine focused on the three strangers. Because all three were watching him with the same interest. As Ethan crossed the room toward the VIP section, Jasmine felt a quiet certainty settle into her mind. The night everyone expected and the night that was actually unfolding were not the same story. And somewhere between those two stories, a truth was waiting to be discovered. As Ethan settled into the VIP section overlooking the rain-soaked skyline, the energy inside the lounge shifted even further. Associates placed tablets, folders, and printed reports across the polished table, while servers quietly delivered drinks and stepped away. From a distance, it looked like the beginning of another successful business meeting. Most guests saw confidence. Jasmine saw choreography. Every movement around the table felt rehearsed. Every presentation seemed designed to lead toward the same conclusion. She continued working behind the bar, arranging glasses and serving customers while keeping one eye on the reflections dancing across the mirrored shelves. Reflections often revealed more than direct observation. People were less careful when they believed nobody was watching. The three strangers remained in their separate positions throughout the lounge. The first sat near the windows with a clear view of Ethan's table. The second occupied a seat near the center of the room, where he could observe both the VIP section and the elevators. The third remained closest to the bar. None interacted. None acknowledged one another. Yet all three reacted to the same moments. When a new document appeared at Ethan's table, they paid attention. When one of the associates became excited about a projection, they watched closely. The synchronization was subtle, but Jasmine could not ignore it. Meanwhile, the discussion itself grew increasingly optimistic. Charts displayed impressive growth forecasts. Market expansion opportunities appeared on large screens. One associate spoke enthusiastically about projected returns over the next 5 years. Another described strategic advantages that supposedly made the opportunity exceptionally safe. Heads nodded around the table. Smiles appeared. Confidence spread quickly. Jasmine noticed something missing. Nobody seemed interested in challenging the assumptions. Nobody appeared eager to test the strongest claims. The conversation was moving forward, but it was not encountering resistance. That bothered her. Strong opportunities survived difficult questions. Weak opportunities depended on avoiding them. As she polished a crystal glass beneath the warm lights, a small detail caught her attention. The man seated closest to the bar briefly checked his phone. A message appeared. Seconds later, the man near the windows adjusted his posture. Moments after that, the third stranger glanced toward Ethan's table and smiled faintly. The sequence happened so quickly that nobody else noticed. Jasmine did. Her instincts sharpened immediately. Across the room, one of Ethan's associates stood to take a call and accidentally left a folder partially open. For only a moment, several pages became visible from Jasmine's position. Numbers. Ownership charts. Supporting entities. The glimpse was brief, but her memory captured details others would have forgotten instantly. Years of training had taught her how to recognize patterns buried inside information. She replayed the image in her mind while serving another customer. Something about the structure felt familiar. Not wrong. Not yet. Just familiar. Outside, lightning flashed silently beyond the clouds, illuminating the skyline for a fraction of a second. Inside, applause broke out at the VIP table after another promising projection appeared on a screen. Everyone seemed increasingly convinced that they were witnessing an extraordinary opportunity. Everyone except Jasmine. As she looked once more toward the three strangers scattered across the lounge, she felt a quiet certainty growing inside her. They were not waiting to discover what would happen next. Somehow, they already believed they knew. The feeling stayed with Jasmine long after the applause faded. While guests celebrated projections and possibilities, she continued replaying the brief image of the ownership charts in her mind. Memory had always worked differently for her. She rarely remembered names after a single introduction, but numbers, structures, and patterns often remained perfectly clear. As she arranged bottles behind the bar, fragments of the document slowly connected themselves. A supporting entity, a familiar sequence, a relationship that seemed insignificant until viewed from the right angle. Across the lounge, Ethan Brooks remained the center of attention. Associates spoke enthusiastically about future opportunities while executives from neighboring tables occasionally glanced toward the VIP section, hoping to catch a glimpse of the discussion. Yet Ethan himself seemed less enthusiastic than everyone around him. He listened more than he spoke. He watched people when they talked rather than focusing on the presentation screens. Several times Jasmine noticed him studying reactions around the table instead of the data itself. That detail interested her. Powerful people often trusted information. Experienced people learned to evaluate the people delivering it. Meanwhile, the three strangers remained exactly where they had been for most of the evening. The man near the windows continued monitoring the VIP section through the reflection in the glass. The second occasionally checked his phone before returning his attention to the meeting. The third appeared relaxed, but his eyes never stayed away from Ethan's table for long. The more Jasmine observed them, the less she believed their presence was a coincidence. Then another moment caught her attention. One of Ethan's associates received a message and immediately smiled. He leaned toward the others and shared whatever he had received. Within seconds, the mood around the table improved even further. More confidence, more optimism, more certainty. Jasmine found that strange. Important decisions were usually strengthened by evidence. This decision seemed strengthened by momentum. She carried a tray toward a nearby customer and quietly listened to fragments of conversation from the VIP section as she passed. Revenue forecasts, expansion plans, strategic partnerships. Every topic sounded impressive, yet nobody appeared interested in discussing what could go wrong. The absence of skepticism felt louder than any argument. Returning to the bar, Jasmine glanced again toward the ownership structure she had reconstructed in her mind. Suddenly, a memory surfaced from years earlier. A conference room in Chicago. Similar charts, similar enthusiasm, similar confidence. Different people, same pattern. The realization caused her to pause. The supporting entities in the current proposal were not entirely separate from one another. They appeared independent on the surface, but deeper connections existed underneath. Connections that concentrated risk instead of distributing it. Jasmine stared toward the VIP table. If she was correct, the acquisition itself was not necessarily flawed. The problem was that several safeguards being presented as protections might not provide the protection everyone believed they would. Across the room, the three strangers seemed increasingly comfortable. One leaned back in his chair. Another checked his watch and smiled faintly. The third finally finished the drink he had barely touched all night. They looked like men watching a result they expected. Outside, rain continued falling across the Manhattan skyline. Inside, confidence continued building around Ethan's table. And for the first time that evening, Jasmine became certain she was no longer looking at separate clues. She was looking at a complete picture. The only question remaining was whether she would have the courage to speak before the decision was made. For several minutes, Jasmine remained behind the bar, saying nothing while the realization settled deeper into her mind. The pattern was no longer incomplete. Every new detail arriving from the VIP table seemed to confirm what she already suspected. The acquisition proposal itself was not the problem. The problem was the confidence surrounding it. Confidence was spreading faster than verification. Around Ethan's table, associates spoke with growing excitement about future opportunities. New charts appeared on screens. Additional projections were shared. Every presentation seemed designed to answer questions before anyone had the chance to ask them. The room responded exactly as expected. Heads nodded. Smiles widened. Glasses were raised. The atmosphere felt increasingly celebratory despite the fact that no final decision had been made. Jasmine watched the reflections in the mirrored shelves behind the bar and noticed something else. The three strangers were no longer simply observing. They appeared relaxed, comfortable, certain. The man closest to the windows leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. The second checked his watch and smiled faintly. The third casually scanned the room before returning his attention to Ethan. None behaved like people waiting to discover an outcome. They behaved like people already confident about one. That detail bothered Jasmine more than anything else she had seen all evening. A customer ordered another drink, and she prepared it automatically while her thoughts continued working through the information. Years earlier, during her time as a forensic accountant, she had learned that dangerous assumptions rarely arrived disguised as danger. They arrived disguised as certainty. People stopped questioning. They stopped testing. They became attached to outcomes. Looking across the lounge, Jasmine saw the same process unfolding in real time. Ethan remained different from the others. While excitement increased around him, he continued studying the people speaking rather than the projections on the screen. Several times, she noticed him watching reactions instead of data. That observation made her hesitate. He was paying attention. Maybe he had noticed something himself. Then a small moment changed everything. One of the associates opened another supporting document and turned several pages while speaking. The movement exposed a section of information for only a few seconds before the page was flipped again. It was enough. Jasmine immediately recognized a reference connected to the ownership structure she had reconstructed earlier. The connection confirmed her suspicion. The entities being presented as independent safeguards shared deeper dependencies beneath the surface. Not obvious dependencies, not dramatic ones, but enough to make the risk profile very different from what everyone believed. Her pulse quickened. Across the room, the man near the center table glanced toward the others. It was brief, almost invisible. Yet for the first time all evening, two of the strangers acknowledged each other's existence. The exchange lasted less than a second. Jasmine saw it anyway. The final missing piece fell into place. She no longer wondered whether something was wrong. She knew it. Outside, rain continued tracing silver lines across the glass overlooking Manhattan. Inside, another round of optimistic discussion filled the VIP section. Ethan's associates appeared closer than ever to recommending immediate approval. Jasmine looked at the documents, then at the strangers, then finally at Ethan Brooks. The decision forming in her mind frightened her. Speaking up could embarrass her. It could cost her job. It could make an entire room dismiss her as someone who did not know her place. Yet remaining silent felt worse. For the first time that night, Jasmine stepped away from the safety of the bar and began walking toward the VIP section. The distance between the bar and the VIP section was less than 30 feet, yet it felt much farther as Jasmine walked across the lounge. Conversations continued around her. Glasses clinked softly. Rain traced silver paths down the windows overlooking Manhattan. Nobody paid much attention to her at first. Why would they? She was the bartender. People noticed her when they needed something, not when she had something to say. At the VIP table, another presentation had just concluded. One associate smiled confidently while summarizing projected returns. Another pointed toward a chart displaying growth forecasts that seemed almost too perfect. Around the table, approval appeared inevitable. Ethan listened quietly, his expression revealing very little. Jasmine slowed as she approached. For a brief moment, doubt entered her mind. What if she was wrong? What if years away from her former career had made her trust instincts that no longer deserved trust? The thought lasted only seconds. Then she remembered the synchronized reactions of the three strangers. She remembered the ownership structure. She remembered the hidden dependencies beneath the surface. The pattern remained unchanged. She continued forward. One associate noticed her first. His expression immediately shifted from concentration to confusion. "Can we help you?" he asked politely, though the question carried a clear message. This conversation did not include her. Several others turned toward Jasmine. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Curiosity replaced confidence. Ethan looked up as well. Unlike the others, he did not appear irritated, only interested. Jasmine stopped beside the table. Every instinct told her to keep her voice calm. "I think you should review the supporting entities again before making a decision," she said. Silence followed. One associate blinked. Another glanced toward a colleague as though expecting someone else to respond. The request seemed so unexpected that nobody immediately knew what to do with it. Finally, a man near the end of the table laughed softly. Not cruelly, simply with disbelief. "You reviewed the acquisition documents?" Jasmine shook her head. Not directly. Several eyebrows rose. The answer appeared to damage her credibility before she could continue. "Then how would you know anything about the structure?" Another associate asked. Jasmine remained composed. "Because patterns repeat." The room grew quieter. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Go on," he said. Jasmine noticed several associates looking uncomfortable. Some seemed annoyed by the interruption. Others appeared curious despite themselves. She focused on Ethan. "Everyone is discussing the opportunity," she said. "Nobody is discussing concentration risk." One associate immediately responded. "We covered risk." Jasmine nodded. "You discussed the appearance of diversification." That answer erased the last traces of conversation from nearby tables. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with attention. Across the lounge, one of the three strangers looked directly toward the VIP section for the first time all evening. Jasmine noticed. Ethan followed her line of sight briefly before returning his attention to her. "Are you saying the structure is misleading?" he asked. Jasmine held his gaze without hesitation. The entire room seemed to stop moving. "I am saying," she replied calmly, that if you ask the same question one more time and follow the answer far enough, you may discover that several independent protections are not as independent as they appear. Nobody spoke. The rain outside continued falling softly against the glass. Then Ethan folded his hands together and looked directly at her. "Try me again," he said, and suddenly the entire lounge went silent. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Even the soft music drifting through the lounge seemed distant now. Jasmine stood beside the table without moving. Around her, executives, investors, and guests watched with open curiosity. Nobody expected the conversation to continue. Nobody expected Ethan Brooks to take her seriously. Yet he remained seated, studying her with the same calm focus he had shown throughout the evening. "Explain it to me," he said. One associate immediately shifted in his chair. "Ethan, with respect, we are discussing a major acquisition. We cannot base decisions on speculation." Ethan never looked away from Jasmine. "Then let her explain why she is not speculating." The room fell silent again. Jasmine took a slow breath. She understood that every second mattered. If she sounded emotional, they would dismiss her. If she sounded uncertain, they would ignore her. Facts were her only protection. "The structure appears diversified," she said. "Several supporting entities are presented as independent layers of protection." One associate nodded confidently. "Correct." Jasmine continued. "But independence only matters if those entities remain independent under stress." A few expressions changed. The statement was simple, but it forced people to think differently. Ethan folded his hands together. "Keep going." Jasmine glanced briefly toward the documents spread across the table. "From what I observed, multiple entities appear connected through the same underlying assets." Another associate frowned. "You observed that from a distance?" "I observed enough to recognize a pattern," Jasmine replied. "The rest comes from experience." Across the lounge, the three strangers remained motionless. Their attention was no longer hidden. They were listening just as carefully as everyone else. Jasmine noticed it immediately. Ethan noticed where she was looking. "Who are they?" he asked quietly. Several heads turned. The three strangers suddenly seemed uncomfortable beneath the attention. Jasmine shook her head. "I do not know who they are." "Then why keep watching them?" Ethan asked. "Because they have been watching you all night." No one laughed. No one interrupted. The statement was too precise, too confident. One associate opened his laptop and quickly reviewed several files. Another requested supporting ownership records from a colleague. The atmosphere around the table had changed. They were no longer defending the deal. They were testing it. That difference mattered. Jasmine could feel it. "Tell me something," Ethan said. "Why risk walking over here?" The question surprised her. Of all the things he could have asked, she had not expected that one. She looked at him honestly. "Because if I am right and I stay silent, then I become part of the mistake." The answer lingered in the air. Ethan said nothing for several seconds. Neither did anyone else. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass while the Manhattan skyline glowed beneath the storm clouds. Finally, Ethan nodded once. "Fair answer." Then he turned toward his team. "Verify everything." Several associates immediately began reviewing files, ownership structures, and supporting documentation. The meeting that had seemed finished only minutes earlier was suddenly starting over from the beginning. Jasmine remained standing beside the table, unsure whether she had helped or created a problem for herself. Then Ethan looked at her once more. "One more question." She met his gaze. "What makes you so certain you have seen this before?" For the first time that night, Jasmine realized the conversation was no longer about the acquisition. It was about her. For a moment, Jasmine considered giving a simple answer. It would have been easier. Easier to say she had a feeling. Easier to pretend she was simply observant. Easier to step back behind the bar and allow the evening to continue without revealing anything personal. But Ethan's question deserved honesty. Around the VIP table, laptops remained open while analysts quietly reviewed documents. Associates exchanged information in low voices. Yet despite the activity, everyone seemed to be listening to her answer. Jasmine glanced toward the rain-covered windows before speaking. Because I spent years looking for problems hidden inside successful presentations. Several associates looked up immediately. Ethan remained silent. What does that mean? He asked. Jasmine folded her hands lightly in front of her. Before I worked here, I worked in corporate investigations and financial analysis. The reaction was immediate. One associate stopped typing. Another slowly removed his glasses. A third stared at her with open disbelief. The bartender, standing beside the table, suddenly seemed like an entirely different person. Jasmine noticed their expressions, but continued calmly. My job was not to find obvious mistakes. My job was to find the risks people stopped looking for because they became too confident. Nobody interrupted. Outside, the rain softened against the glass. Inside, the atmosphere shifted again. Earlier, they had questioned why she was speaking. Now, they wanted to know more. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. And you saw something similar before. Jasmine nodded. Several years ago. Her voice remained steady, but the memory was clear. A group of investors became excited about an opportunity that looked almost perfect. Strong projections, strong partners, strong protections. Every meeting reinforced the same conclusion. One associate quietly asked, "What happened?" Jasmine looked toward the documents spread across the table. The protections were not independent. The room fell silent. On paper, they appeared separate. In reality, they relied on the same underlying support structure. Several analysts exchanged glances. The similarity was impossible to ignore. When conditions changed, Jasmine continued. The protections failed together instead of separately. Nobody spoke. The comparison landed exactly where it needed to. Ethan studied her carefully. And you found that? Jasmine smiled faintly. Eventually, the smile faded. Not before people ignored the warnings. The honesty in her voice carried more weight than any dramatic story could have. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was explaining why she could not remain silent tonight. Across the lounge, the three strangers appeared noticeably less comfortable than before. One checked his phone repeatedly. Another avoided looking toward the VIP table altogether. Jasmine noticed. So did Ethan. He followed her gaze for a brief moment before returning his attention to her. You gave up that career? He asked. Jasmine hesitated. Life changes. It was not a complete answer, but it was enough. Ethan nodded as though he understood there were chapters she preferred not to discuss. Nearby, one analyst suddenly looked up from his screen. His expression had changed. I found something, he said quietly. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward him. The analyst rotated his laptop toward the group and pointed to a series of ownership connections hidden beneath several layers of documentation. The room grew still. Jasmine did not need to see the screen to know what he had found. She recognized the look on his face. It was the expression people wore when a pattern they hoped did not exist suddenly became impossible to ignore. The analyst's words seemed to absorb every remaining sound in the lounge. Nobody reached for a drink. Nobody checked a phone. Even the guests at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. The analyst enlarged the ownership records on his screen and pointed toward a series of connections buried beneath multiple layers of documentation. These entities are linked, he said quietly. Not directly, but they ultimately rely on the same underlying collateral structure. A second analyst immediately began reviewing the information independently. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard while the rest of the table watched. Seconds felt longer than minutes. Jasmine remained standing beside the VIP section, saying nothing. She had already learned an important lesson years earlier. Once evidence begins speaking, people stop listening to opinions. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the screen. Across the room, the three strangers who had appeared so comfortable earlier no longer looked relaxed. The man near the windows checked his watch twice in less than a minute. Another suddenly became interested in his phone. The third stared toward the exit. Their confidence was disappearing at exactly the same pace as the illusion surrounding the deal. The second analyst finally stopped typing. He looked at Ethan, then at the others around the table. The connection is real. Nobody spoke. If market conditions shift, several protections could be affected simultaneously. One associate leaned back slowly in his chair. Another removed his glasses and stared at the documents spread across the table. Earlier in the evening, those same pages had inspired excitement. Now they inspired caution. Ethan remained silent for several moments. His expression never changed, but everyone around him understood the significance of what had just happened. The meeting had been moving toward a conclusion. Now, it was moving toward a reconsideration. Additional files were requested. More records were reviewed. Every new examination seemed to reveal another layer of dependency hidden beneath the presentation. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just risk that had been disguised by complexity. The difference mattered. One associate finally looked toward Jasmine. There was no skepticism left in his eyes, only respect. "How did you see this from across the room?" he asked. Jasmine gave a small shrug, the same way people notice a familiar face in a crowd. Nobody laughed. The answer felt strangely accurate. Patterns were familiar to her in ways that were difficult to explain. Across the lounge, the first of the three strangers stood from his table and quietly walked toward the elevators. No one stopped him. A minute later, the second followed. The third remained seated briefly before gathering his jacket and leaving as well. Their departure drew almost as much attention as their presence had earlier. Ethan watched the elevator doors close behind them before turning back toward the table. The silence that followed felt different now. Earlier it had been uncertainty. Now it was realization. One by one, the people around him began understanding the same uncomfortable truth. The person who had protected them from a costly mistake was not one of the consultants, not one of the executives, not one of the experts invited to the meeting. It was the woman everyone had assumed belonged only behind the bar. Outside, the rain finally began to fade. Manhattan shimmered beneath clearing clouds while reflections danced across the glass walls. Inside, the room that had started the evening full of certainty now sat quietly in the presence of something far more valuable: perspective. And for the first time all night, every eye in the lounge seemed to be looking at Jasmine differently. For several moments after the last stranger disappeared into the elevator, nobody at the VIP table spoke. The city beyond the glass seemed brighter now that the rain had passed, thousands of lights stretching across Manhattan beneath a clearing sky. Inside the lounge, however, all attention remained fixed on Jasmine. She stood quietly beside the table, uncomfortable with the spotlight that had suddenly found her. She had never walked over expecting recognition. She had only wanted the right questions to be asked before a decision became irreversible. Ethan looked down at the documents one final time before closing the folder. The soft sound echoed through the silence. Around him, associates exchanged thoughtful glances. Earlier in the evening, they had been certain. Now, they understood how close certainty had come to becoming a mistake. One of the executives finally stood from his chair and faced Jasmine. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I assumed you were interrupting something you could not possibly understand." Another nodded in agreement. "So did I." Jasmine offered a small smile. "You do not owe me anything." "Actually," the first man replied, "I think we do." The sincerity in his voice made the moment feel genuine. Nobody was apologizing because they felt pressured. They were apologizing because they had learned something about themselves. Ethan rose from his chair and looked across the room. Guests who had spent the evening watching from a distance quickly looked away, pretending they had not been paying attention. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth before he turned back toward Jasmine. "You saved us from making a very expensive mistake tonight." Jasmine shook her head gently. "Your team found the truth after you pointed them toward it," Ethan replied. The distinction mattered. Everyone knew it. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The atmosphere had changed completely from when she first approached the table. There was no tension left. No skepticism. Only respect. Ethan studied her carefully. "You miss it, do not you?" Jasmine tilted her head slightly. "Miss what?" "The work." The question caught her by surprise. She glanced toward the skyline before answering. "Sometimes." Ethan nodded as though he had expected that answer. "You were very good at it." Jasmine laughed softly. Apparently, I am still incapable of ignoring patterns. A few people around the table smiled. The mood finally relaxed. Nearby conversations slowly returned throughout the lounge. Glasses clinked again. Music became noticeable once more. Life resumed. Yet something fundamental had changed. The people who entered that room believing status determined value were leaving with a different understanding. Ethan pulled an empty chair away from the table and gestured toward it. Not as an order, not as a reward, simply as a sign of respect. Jasmine looked at the chair and then toward the bar waiting for her across the room. I still have customers, she said. Ethan laughed quietly. Fair enough. As she walked back toward the marble counter, dozens of eyes followed her. Not because she had demanded attention, not because she had embarrassed anyone, but because she had demonstrated something rare. Wisdom without arrogance, confidence without ego, courage without drama. And as the lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass behind her, everyone in that lounge learned the same lesson. Intelligence does not become valuable when people finally recognize it. It was valuable all along.